Welcome y bienvenidos to this episode of the Cultural Capacity Podcast. I am your host and guide, Justine Gonzalez, also the founder of Educator Aid Incorporated. We sponsor this podcast ourselves, and as such, I would be remiss if I didn't encourage you to check out some opportunities not only for giving back, but also for expanding your own knowledge in your leadership journey. So, the first thing I want to introduce you to is in the show notes. I need you to go there right now. And in the show notes, there are always going to be a section just for resources with any episode that we put out. Now, our team takes time to make sure that these resources are aligned to the content of each episode. We are also getting better, and I'll tell on myself as the hostess here. We are getting better about our release schedule. And one of the things that you can expect as a subscriber to this podcast and or our YouTube page, which is where you can see these interviews, I would encourage you to hit subscribe for sure on the link to our YouTube page below. But this is where we put the freebies, the resources, the articles that align with the content of the episodes, and all of the details you need for connecting with our guests on our featured voices episodes like this one here that you're about to dive into. I want to specifically draw your attention to the very first link in the resources, which is going to remain there for quite some time. I've gotten the pleasure of serving on the board of the nonprofit Educate Me Foundation for nearly 3 years. And at Educate Me Foundation Incorporated, we are a social enterprise that is determined to increase the number of men and women of color in the field of education specifically. We seek to change the education system by creating a continuum for men and women of color to grow, achieve, and succeed from high school to career. And at this point, you can check out the website, but I specifically linked there if you could be willing to even commit to giving $5 a month through the giving campaign. It would be greatly appreciated. Welcome y bienvenidos to this episode of the Cultural Capacity Podcast. I am your host and teacher for this episode, Justine Gonzalez. And I want to welcome you first and foremost to be sure that right now you hit subscribe or follow on your preferred platform. If you're listening to this podcast episode, we also encourage you to click in the show notes below and hit subscribe on our Educator Aid Incorporated official YouTube channel. And go check out this interview there. Every month we release one featured voices extended episode, sometimes 1 to 2 hours long, and where we sit down at the virtual table. We might be sipping coffee, tea, water, juice, whatever you prefer. But we get to introduce you to some incredible thought leaders from all over the world, across sectors. And I'm so glad that you're here and you've decided to tune in. So I would recommend highly that you do view these on YouTube so you can see myself and the guests. You can see how we interact. You can see some of the most powerful moments and quotes from our featured voices guests on our shorts on Educator Aid as well. So say that you don't have time to watch the whole episode at once, or you even want a poignant little video to show or send to someone, etc., or to share to social media. That would be where you find some of our best content. And we want to give a special shout out and thank you to our Vice President of Innovation and Marketing here at Educator Aid Incorporated, my sister and yours, Kara Gonzalez Howard. Thank you, sister, so much for all you do in positioning this content and helping us share the mission and vision of Educator Aid with the world. Now, on to our official Educator Aid Inc. sponsored podcast, Cultural Capacity. If you're here, you already know. If you're new, I welcome you. And I encourage you to jump into this episode with me. Let's get compassionately curious together. Woo! I cannot think of a better featured voice as schools reopen to start a new school year. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a principal, a student, an aspiring teacher, somebody who has children in K-12 schools right now, I encourage you to listen and share this episode. Not only did she recently come out with an incredible book with the foreword written by the previous Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan himself, but it not only comes so highly recommended from other voices, I got to tell you, Dr. Aimee Evan is also just one of my favorite people. Hands down, we have been in the trenches together working through our PhD program. She is now officially Dr. Aimee Evan and has authored this incredible text that recently came out called Student-Centered School Improvement. You can find it anywhere books are sold. I have also linked the direct Amazon link in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out. But not only is it inspirational, but my goodness, she again has become a dear friend over the past 6 to 7 years, I think, at this point. We're going on 6 years about of knowing each other. I'm still plugging away at that PhD, and she's not only been a confidant and somebody I admire and look up to, but she's been an incredible inspiration to me as I continue on that journey. So, number one, thank you, Aimee. And number two, I'm just so glad that you all get to listen to this powerful conversation with the Dr. Aimee Evan. Let's jump into this conversation on this episode of the Cultural Capacity Podcast. All right. Welcome, Aimee Evan. I'm always get my words twisted when I start this in the morning. Welcome, y bienvenidos to the Cultural Capacity Podcast. I'm your hostess and teacher on this episode, Justine Gonzalez, and we have an extra special guest today. Just like any of our extended and featured voices episodes, remember that these are about an hour long, and we encourage you to view them on our YouTube channel because you can see the interaction. But if you're listening, we're going to do our best. Like if we're highlighting something or whatever, we're going to do our best to make sure that we narrate it. So if you're listening only on the podcast stream, then you also have the same experience. Like you are sitting here with us. Y'all know when it's not a featured voices episode, our format is typically around 15 minutes, and we are designed specifically for you to have some introspection with one question, going deeper with that, and however you end up using that. My hope is that you use it to reflect on yourself. So already, thank you for showing up for you today, and we're going to get ready to dive in. So one thing I always do, Aimee, is when I introduce guests, it is a little bit non-traditional because I like for you all to talk about your celebrations, your accomplishments. We're going to hear a little bit of your cultural origin story and how that's impacted you as well. Some things about your childhood maybe, but I always like to start with pointing out something I really admire about the guests that we get to feature. So I hope it doesn't make you too uncomfortable. I know some people, including myself, I've had to learn how to, with compliments, just be like, oh, thank you, instead of deflecting it and go, oh, okay. So I like to start with something that I admire. One thing in particular, there's two things, but one thing I really admire about Aimee is her commitment. So number one, you all should know that Aimee and I met in our PhD program. So we have known each other now like 5 years. It's kind of insane to think about that. But the commitment comes in where she was the only person in our cohort, which is based in the Midwest, and she would fly in from DC. And I'm like, this chick is wild. So I really admired your commitment. And then also one thing too is I admire the fact that I know you have a family. You're doing incredible things to impact our educational system nationally in the United States, and you're also a mom. So that ability to really be in your passion and pursue it while also being a kick-ass wife and mom, all the things, I really admire that about you as well. So I like to always give people their flowers first. And now we'll hop into my official intro. And well, I've got a surprise, but it'll be towards the end of this podcast. So with that, no, I'm going to do it now. I've changed my mind. She doesn't know I'm going to do this. So if you are just listening, I got to make sure I'm in the screen here. If you are just listening, I'm opening a package, and my package came from Amazon yesterday. So the truth is, I have not read your book yet, Aimee, but it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, the author of the newly released text, Student-Centered School Improvement, Identifying Systemic Changes Essential for Success, by Dr. Aimee Evan. So I just received and opened my copy. I know my screen's blurred. I'm trying to make sure it shows. There we go. But I'm super proud of you, not only as a colleague, but as a friend, and just excited for you to share more about this too with us. So without further ado, would love to hear just however you want to start by introducing yourself. You could talk professional first, personal. I'll ask you some follow-up questions and we'll get the conversation going. So here is Dr. Aimee Evan. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Let's jump in.
Oh, Justine, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. I'm excited about the book. I'm excited it's a tangible, not just something on my computer anymore, but a tangible something I can show my grandpa.
Yes, exactly.
I made something.
Yeah, and he's not like, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean you're a researcher? What do you do? Like, what does that produce?
Exactly. I am the only one in my family to not like have tangible, build tangible things. Every other person in my family is blue collar, is, electrician, an iron worker, a heavy machinery driver. I was the only one that was like, I am not, I am not coordinated enough for any of that.
So start there with us, because we have another unique connection point. You, and it is Chicago. So talk to us a little bit about your upbringing to start with, and then how you essentially became Dr. Evan.
I know.
Little girl from near Southside of Chicago.
Who would have thunk?
Yes.
So I'll actually start kind of from the beginning, because I think there's some things that I bring forth with me through this work. And I will say, Justine, you are probably the only one to ever get me to open up like this. So I appreciate the space and the, I guess the ability, because I will share with you that lots of this has not been previously shared before.
Okay.
So,
I'm about to learn a bunch too, listeners.
So my parents actually met in the Army. My mom grew up on the southeast side of Chicago, and once she graduated high school, the high school I would have went to, when she graduated high school, she got out of Dodge. She was like, I'm going in the Army. I'm getting out of here. She accidentally got pregnant at 19 with yours truly. It was a very tumultuous marriage to my dad. Okay. We had, I ended up with a younger brother who's 5 years younger than me. And when he was born, things just kind of went really south for my mom and my dad. So my parents split up. My dad is Native American. He's part Native American, and unfortunately comes with many of the stereotypes of Native American families. He was an alcoholic. He was very abusive to my mom, never to my brother or I, but it was really hard on my mom. And she finally decided she had had enough. So we very quickly moved back to Chicago. We moved in with my grandparents, where we stayed and lived with my grandparents for several years, most of my elementary childhood. I loved it. My mom, on the other hand, was not a fan.
Yeah, she was back at mom and dad's.
She was back at mom and dad's. And honestly, my grandpa, who is still alive and kicking at 96 years old, is a tough guy. And we'll get into some of his like isms that, I still bring, and some of them are very prominent in our own family. The kids know it. Like my kids say them, my husband says them, they just kind of come with you through. But my grandpa on the other hand was an immigrant from Poland.
Okay.
He went through Chicago public schools until the 3rd grade and then worked because his family, he had 13 brothers and sisters. His mom was unfortunately ill. His dad was very, very tough. And by 15, my grandpa was running a crew of over 50 employees. Like, he is a very hard worker. And he has always been, and that's kind of the life that she was trying to escape.
Yeah.
And then she landed back in, but it was good for her and for us to get back on our feet. We were, she was a single mom. We were on welfare. We, thank God, had my grandparents. Otherwise, I really am not sure what would have happened. We lived in some sketchy apartments after that because she could finally scrape enough money together. She worked at a grocery store in the deli when we first moved back, because she had a high school diploma. She didn't have a whole lot of skills when we first moved back. So, that's where we started. And when I look back, and when I was researching for the book, I found a quote from the Secretary of Education in the 1980s when I was in school at Chicago Public Schools. And he said it was the worst school system in the US. And none of us knew it. None of us knew. We didn't know any different because I was 3rd generation at that point. That was all my family knew was Chicago Public Schools. Now, my mom knew enough about the high school where I would go, which had gotten worse by the time I was going to go through there. At that point, they weren't married, but she had started dating my stepdad. They ended up getting married years later. Actually, after my husband and I got married, they ended up getting married.
Wow. Okay.
So, and I think it was because I wouldn't let her have too much say into my wedding.
Yeah.
Throw around.
Make the one you always wanted, Mom. Yes.
Because we're very different in a lot of ways. But we're very different. Like, she loves the, like the pomp and the everything coordinated. And I'm like, let's have a pig picking and
go to
the backyard.
Yeah,
exactly. So I was able to and got the opportunity to go to a private high school in East Chicago, Indiana, called Bishop Knoll. And
Justine, so listeners, I don't know that I knew you specifically or remembered that you went to Bishop Knoll. So 7 years ago, I launched a high school in East Chicago and lived there. I don't think you even knew that. So me and Aimee's paths get even more crosshaired, and you all might witness it through this interview. But I am very familiar with all 12 square miles of East Chicago. And also Bishop Knoll. So sorry, go on. I had to say that because we're learning stuff about each other in this conversation too.
Right, exactly. Yeah, our paths kind of like twisty turny together, which is fun.
Yes.
So that was probably my very first experience of getting out of the South Side of Chicago. Like whatever you have to say about segregation, I think one of the things that it does if you grow up in a really poor area and everybody is poor is you don't realize it. And
correct.
It's wonderful. Because once I got out of the South Side and I went to high school, I was like, you mean my Alsip flea market Ghetto Couture isn't
the Alsip flea market? If you're from Chicago, but
it's not in here.
Yes. So you're going from that environment to then a private Catholic, this is, and y'all have to understand, I know about Bishop Noel because we were not that high school. Like we heard about the tuition rates. We heard about like they are known, like they are a very, very top-notch private Catholic school. So that had to be like shocking for you.
Oh, without a doubt, in every shape, way, or form. I mean, I kid about the Alpha flea market, our like starter jacket pullovers.
Yeah.
But it was shocking from an academic standpoint, like just
Wow.
educationally. It was shocking from the cultural standpoint, obviously, with, like, I don't even know where you guys go shopping for clothes because I've never seen any of that.
What's limited?
Right. Or like,
Yeah.
Benetton was a big one. Yeah, we went to Kmart, not the flea market.
We went to Kmart too, and we would use layaway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, that was and I say I've never really opened up about my background and stuff because I think of these, like, I think in high school I learned to sort of like shut it down, like this is not acceptable. And I'll say the other thing too is language. Like, I grew up, and you know this about me, I have a potty mouth. I curse a lot, but it was not something that was, funny. Like, I was laughing as I was thinking about this. We'd ask my grandma, like, Grandma, what's for dinner? Shit, you want some?
Yeah, no, my great grandma, who is Amish and then conservative Mennonite, but it's a normal part because if you're on an Amish farm, that's what they call poop or crap. Like, it's just and so listeners and viewers, remember what Aimee said at the beginning of this interview. She comes from a long line of blue collar workers. So in those time periods, and you think about that your grandfather was managing a crew of 50 by the age of 15. By 15, right? And these are steel workers. This is height of industry rising in Chicago area, the Midwest area. Like, remember that often, I just want to make this point really quick because it's coming to me, but often in our workplaces, in our schools, everything. And I grew up being trained to think this way because I grew up in a very conservative religious home, that people who cuss are bad, or we make a judgment about somebody's education level based on their language or their dialect or how they sound, etc. But keep in mind, like, just because that's your vantage point or that's maybe your own bias coming through, that's just normal part of speaking for many people. So I think that's something to remember, like, and that's always been a little tricky for me, to be honest with you, as a teacher and principal, of how you even explain to kids why they're not supposed to say certain things at school, other than, hey, when I come to work, I don't wear pajamas. Although that kind of changed during the pandemic. but you know what I mean? Like, you almost then have this conundrum, and I know you're going to get into this, but we had this conundrum becoming teachers and administrators and school people, because you're like, but also, like, do I even really have a problem with that? But I'm trying to regulate it because I'm supposed to. Anyways, little side. I just wanted to point that out to the listeners too, a full circle. That's something we like to do here, no matter who we're at the table with, no matter what question we're asking ourselves is, wow, do I still react a certain way when I hear somebody say shit or damn? And do I think it's inappropriate or unprofessional? I don't know. I don't know. So sorry. Go back to
no, I think that was the point I was trying to make, is that it just because, like, I learned to really subsume those, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I do think there are a time and a place for certain things.
Yep.
I think the part that I want to portray to listeners is that, just what you mentioned, Justine, just because a family may curse, or maybe they're dressed differently, or maybe the language that they use doesn't come across as being sophisticated,
Right.
doesn't mean that they are any less than, or any that their potential is any lower than anyone else's. And I think that was something that I had to learn, because growing up,
Same.
there wasn't a big push academically. It was only when I got to high school that I realized the amount of time I wasted in elementary school. So in elementary school, I actually started in kindergarten in Virginia and could read by the time I got to kindergarten. My mom stayed home during this crazy marriage.
Same.
But I think part of what kept her there was the ability to stay home. My mom is very loving. Like, she was born to be a mom.
Aww.
But all, like, the day she had to go to work killed her. And you know, and you could tell that her priority was always her family. And
that's beautiful.
now I think she considers her family her work colleagues. So she takes care of them and like mothers them and stuff. But I think so I got to kindergarten being able to read. And when I got to Chicago, they didn't know what the heck to do with me. So I was
so similar to my experience.
Yeah, so I was in they didn't have, you know, any kind of like gifted and talented or anything like that. But I spent a lot of time cleaning erasers and grading papers,
bulletin boards, taking
bulletin boards
down.
Yes,
same.
Because like they just didn't know what to do with me. And when I got to high school, I was like, what the, like, I'm not prepared.
Right.
I struggled so bad in high school with the transition from, and I thought, you know, that's a load of crap. But no one thought I could handle the extra challenge, but yet, you know, I was held back from a lot of what, and please don't hear me that I think, you know, I'm the smartest person. There were a lot of us in elementary, and we were K-8, so it's elementary through 8th grade. There were a ton of us who could have been challenged so much more. But because we grew up on the Southeast side, and the going job sector was the steel mill, they just assumed we were steel mill material, and what the heck were we going to do with an education?
I'll point this out too, geographically, for people to understand why Chicago is still considered one of the most segregated cities in the US. I'm going to add this note as well, Aimee, because we have a lot of listeners from around the world. In the United States in particular, many of you might know, many of our systems were developed and they weren't equal. They weren't equal specifically for enslaved Africans, Black people in America. And then that trickle down happens from a colorism standpoint, from a racial white supremacy standpoint to indigenous folks, et cetera, where even the likes of me and Aimee of that caste system are still seen as, and I will say this even from visiting other Latino-based countries. My father's background is Puerto Rican, but many of that stems from Spain. And Spain, and I'm a person with Spanish blood, right? And we'll probably get into more of this conversation later about what that means when you're a person like Aimee, who you not only have native and indigenous blood, but you also have Polish or European bloods and all those things within you. One of the things, as I've researched more of that, they had a very intricate, even in the 15 and 1600s, Spanish colonizers had a very intricate, you can find little pictures, chart of 16, like the cast of 16 of the purest being, two white people being together, right? Two of the lightest skin, to where then you and I would still be considered somewhere on a lower rung because, well, your blood's all mixed up. Your blood's all mixed up. And somebody did something with somebody else who had more color than this person. So I say that as a lesson because then you still see those effects, and it was specifically ingrained into even our financial systems here in the US, our zip codes, everything, specifically for Black people. When you hear about redlining in Chicago, the reason why I say this about Chicago is because we still see this happening today. And because the system was never designed for all, and because it's been broken, those resources don't go there. And it's exactly that mentality, because I think people think, oh, well, it's a big city, there's lots of money and there's lots of taxes there. What she's saying about Southside mentality, it's perpetuated on West Side too. My longtime partner of 10 plus years, Thaddeus, he's a product of Chicago Public Schools, West Side. And when you have those pockets, it's by intentional design. And again, I'm sure Dr. Evan will get into this, but giving some context to some people around the globe as to why there's also such a fight. And her book is so important to recognize that lens of truly, how do I identify those things systemically to actually focus them back on students? Because otherwise, we do continue to just go focus on the things that Aimee and I can't go in there and say, hey, this is a 200-year-old system that doesn't work for anyone and still holds the same stereotypes for kids on the South Side and kids on the West Side. So what can we do though, right, to shift that? So little lesson as far as like even segregation and how that impacts our public school systems here in the United States.
Yeah, agreed. And I think if this type of story of you and I's upbringing and where we ended up is a shock to anyone, that is a product of the system. Like, you can look at us and assume that maybe we didn't come from pedigree, but we came from middle class background, and any other assumption that you make of any other person, depending on race, ethnicity, like that. Like, our system is designed, I feel like, to and part of the reason why I wanted to share was, there are lots of us who have worked to break out of the system, and we are working to ensure that it doesn't have to be outliers who do so. That the system can be redesigned so that potential is not dependent on where you grew up or where your family background is. And I'll share with you, I think one of the things that we explored in our graduate program, Justine, you may remember, we did a project together where we looked at Raj Chetty has taken the tax records of 32 million people living in the United States. Now, granted, it doesn't include people who don't file taxes. It doesn't include people who don't for whatever reason. But he looked at where you are likely to end up on the social status ring, like your socioeconomic status, depending on where you started. And when Raj Chetty came here from India, which is a very explicitly caste system, he was blown away by how similar the United States is set up. And so if we really think it's not, unfortunately, the data show us otherwise. And some of his findings, like the Opportunity Atlas and his projections in terms of like what dissipates your background, et cetera, is fascinating. So I would welcome folks to look into some of his research, because it is really quite eye-opening.
Yeah. Okay. So talk to us a little bit, because obviously you had the socioeconomic shift. You had already seen some struggles of your own father, these other pieces that obviously add to the level of baggage and trauma. I have to ask this question then for viewers and listeners, because again, it's a shared identity thing that Aimee and I have. During all of that happening, did you grow up in a world where you also then became aware first of all, like, do you now at this point, let me ask this question first. At this point, do you identify as a third culture kid? Meaning a person who grew up with two very distinct bicultural, I'm sure your father's complexion was different than your mother's, on top of there's a certain perspective about him and where he comes from. And then the same with your Polish mother, right? Like, did you grow up in a world thinking that? And do you see yourself that way now? Or like, where do you find yourself with your identity then?
So I feel and think of myself as, so when my parents got divorced, we moved back to Chicago. My dad moved to New York. I had very little interaction with him and his
Okay.
family. So in terms of his influence on my life,
Mhm.
there was none. In fact, the
Okay.
last memory I have is the last time I saw him, I was 10. So he would, and I think I only saw him once or twice before that. So my entire upbringing was really based within the culture of my mom's family.
Yep. Yep.
So not, and it's funny, my dad passed away in 2017, and I I actually got the like gumption to go up there and go to his funeral. And I think it was because he was not there. Like, that sounds horrible, but it was so hurtful how the whole thing ended up,
Yep.
that it was easier to go and not have to face him. But I've actually established a stronger relationship with my dad's family, with my two half sisters,
Wow.
who he was married to their mom when he got my mom pregnant, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's a whole messy ordeal.
Look, so y'all know, and this is what also can happen with third culture kid. I consider you a third culture kid, even if, here's the other thing too. I know we have so many labels flying around right now, but like, I always distinguish that only because I really grew up in both worlds. And I don't think until adulthood, I realized like, oh, that's actually really unique. And many third culture kids, we're out here everywhere, but they have a story similar to yours. And I find this too, regardless of if you present as light, dark, whatever skin tone, I just find that there does tend to be a gravitation more towards one side of the culture, right? Of your makeup. And we often then find a lot of secret family members and other things, because it's just part of, I think sometimes there's also guilt and shame, because
Oh yeah.
people then you're also judged in this lens, and we got to think about our parents. They're doing this in a generation when it really was not acceptable to interrelate across racial and ethnic lines. Like, there's also some degree of, well, that would never be accepted, or, oh, they're a sellout because they married this type of like, there are so many layers that come up when you distinctly have two different types of lineages. And it's not the more relatable of like, oh, my mom's family is Scottish and my dad's family is English, right? Like, that's a little bit more, not that those are the same. English and Scottish people, I know there's a big difference, okay? I do know that historically. And when we're thinking of the global context that still exists, unfortunately, because I think, so many of us, we want to live in a post-racial society. And we also have to be real that these are the structures that still exist. So we can't bypass that and say that it's not like, it is still shocking for many, many, many people to fathom even marrying somebody outside of their tribe in a lot of countries. So
You're right. You're absolutely right.
I put that out there only to then look at, if we go back to younger Aimee, when did you start grappling with your identity from that lens? because at the time it sounds like your dad had left, you went and had these like, holy hell, I don't even know some of the words they're saying, where they're shopping. Like, you had the culture blast from a socioeconomic standpoint.
Right.
Obviously, both of us are white passing. Like, we might get different shades of beige in the summer, but
I
like,
love that.
yeah, but yeah, 50 Shades of, oh, that's our book. That's gonna be our book. 50
there
Shades.
you go.
Okay, sorry. But that's the curious question that I always have for people when we do live in this space of, like, I have different identities and I have very different looking people in my family than what I am, right? When did you start to grapple with that aspect of just who you are?
I think I still grapple with it.
Okay.
So
Same. I mean,
I don't know if I grapple with it so much from a racial ethnic background, only because I really didn't grow up with my dad's side of the family.
it
And
wasn't embracing and
no,
feeling and for me, it's like, no, we were always told, be proud of being Puerto Rican. Like, it didn't matter. And you'd go to a house, right? With my grandpa's one of 27 kids. See, okay, they're not all
wow.
the same person. So a guy
Right.
here with what happens. But all that to say, I mean, all shades, all races, like,
Right.
it's
I
a
think for
lot.
me, it's more of a socioeconomic thing.
Okay.
For sure. 100%. Like I had, and so, we're in Maryland now. I'm on the East Coast. It's a very different, like that was even a culture shock of moving to the East Coast from the Midwest, because it is
Yep.
quite different. And at my daughter's soccer game, one of the moms is a former teacher, and she said something, she made some comment about kids coming from the trailer park. And I whipped around, and I had to determine because what I really wanted to say was not a very nice comment. What I did say was, I lived in a trailer park. And she was like, what? And I said, and my cousin slept in the bathtub because we didn't have any room.
Right.
And I followed it. I could have walked away, which is what I really wanted to, but I followed it up to say, the kids aren't any different from yours or ours.
That's right.
They may live in a different house, but they are no different than your daughter or my daughter.
That's right.
And I have learned to not take those comments personally, because for a really long time I had a chip on my shoulder where I thought, who do you think you are? Because you didn't have those experiences, you're better. And I've had to come to the realization that it's perspective. It's not necessarily, at least I'm going to give folks the benefit of the doubt. It's not necessarily a good thing, bad thing, or I'm better than you, you're less than. Although between you and I and all of our listeners, I think there's quite a bit of that too going on.
Absolutely.
But I think it's our job to really educate and to be the spokesperson to say, you know what, just because we lived in a trailer park didn't mean that we don't deserve to stand here next to you. It's just
right.
It's more of an educating opportunity, I think, than a like a lash out or like a put down opportunity.
That's usually, I love the way you frame that, and it almost then gives you, subscribers, it gives you kind of a framework for when you encounter these moments, because similar to Aimee, like, yes, when you're in that moment. I know when I'm in those moments and I'm like, this is 7-year-old Justine acting out right here, deeply wounded because of XYZ. But then, we all have those moments where we don't say it so eloquently. And maybe in those moments, that's how it's supposed to be, to get that. I don't know. But I think, again, what we try to do here as well at Cultural Capacity is just look at those different lenses. And how do we just take that as feedback And sometimes that feedback to us is, yeah, it's not really a safe person for me to be around right now because of
Right.
the comments they make or the disparaging thoughts that they decide to share or whatever. I think back to even, I don't know if you know this story or not, but I think back to this actually even in our PhD cohort. Aimee has finished, mine is still in progress, just so you all know. But there was an introductory thing that we had, and it was a very similar situation, but somebody in our cohort, I remember her just saying, she was complaining about how rough a specific area is. Well, it happened to be where I live, literally, by the high school where she had been a school leader. And I remember in that situation, just because there's other people around, right? Just saying, really? I said, I haven't necessarily had that experience. I actually live in those apartments that you're talking about. So like that's where worlds collide. And I think people need to know that even from like academia, because I think that's another thing we share. We're both very like first generation in a lot of ways with even our educational access. I don't think any of my grandparents went beyond like an 8th grade education. My like my parent, our parents did not either. Like our parents graduated high school, mine did. So those wounds are important to also identify because sometimes we also conflate, oh, we make this jump like, oh, they're doing this because of this. And a lot of it is our own wounds coming out and going, oh, they're judging me because of this. Or something that maybe a classmate said when we were like 10 years old about our shoes or about where the bus dropped us off.
Right.
That's the thing that then is showing itself. And then it doesn't cause us to be able to eloquently address it like you named. So what would you advise people then if they're in that situation? Because now we've been in circles where we're meeting with state and national secretaries of education, but yet we're also still those same little girls. So I think it's a really powerful conversation, especially if you're a person who's struggling with imposter syndrome. Like, how do you learn to be an advocate still and walk in and out of those worlds, but then also not wear your own wounds? Because I think it happens to a lot of us who we get that privilege of getting another degree or something. And then you almost like, I don't know, you almost self-sabotage in some ways, like, well, I still don't really belong here though.
Oh,
How do you deal with that? Because you're in your current life, you work with a pretty well-known research firm, correct? Yeah. Is that
I,
what they're called? Are they a research center or?
we are research and technical assistants. Not really, I guess not center. We have centers, but so I work at Wested, a place that when I was a teacher, I always wanted to work at. And now I'm like, I'm not here.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
But I think to answer your question, Justine, I don't know if we ever get comfortable with it. I think what you mentioned in terms of gauging the situation is really spot on. If this is just someone in passing, I'm not gonna waste, I guess, the time necessarily, the energy, but this was someone, my daughter would like to play soccer on this team for a while. And I was like, man, we're in it for the long haul. I gotta get this, get this right.
Yep.
In order for my own sanity and my
Yep.
daughter's reputation on the team.
Right. Because in her world, that's the biggest thing.
Yes. Yes.
You got to show up for her.
Like a couple things. And I think when I reread the Coleman report, and for those of you listening, if you're not familiar, I don't even know what the actual title of it was. It's just like colloquially known as the Coleman report because he was the lead researcher on it. But back in 1965, there was this, and it was part of the New Deal. There was this desire to really understand why we were getting differences in educational outcomes. So
Yeah.
James Coleman, who I actually worked with his son, who is lovely, by the way.
Wow.
Lovely, lovely man.
Awesome.
Who's also an education researcher. So it's kind of funny. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But Coleman, one of his big findings was that the family really has the biggest influence over where you end up as in your life trajectory. And the more I read, the more I learn, the more I interact with kids and families and adults who have kind of broken the mold, the more I'm like, it's not so much influence. I think that was the wrong word. I think it's more about information. Like I think about my grandpa who had a third grade education. My family always always pushed the idea of college, college, college. They had that expectation. They had the desire for all of us to do well. But
they knew it could give you something. They knew it could give you something.
Right. But they didn't really have the information to get there. Like it took me until I was 22 to figure out how to go to college.
Okay.
And it took me until I was 44 to figure out how to get a doctorate.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily influence so much as I think it's information. And I think and now being a parent, I can see how desirable it is for your kids to do well. You want them to be happy. You want what's best for them. You don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to toil. Like I think about my grandpa coming home from working in the steel mill and being exhausted and being covered in soot and dirt. He didn't want that for his kids.
That's right.
How hard he worked. And that's what we want for our children. We want what's best for them. And I think there's a lot of influence that families have on children, but there's a lack of information that they have. We take folks that, and I remember when I worked at a school, and even in my own situation, I didn't know to take AP courses. I didn't know you could study for the SAT. I didn't know you do college tours and all that stuff. We just didn't know. There's a lack of information, I feel like, for families who, I didn't know that music notes don't go in order like the alphabet. I've never taken a music class.
Right.
My daughter thinks I'm crazy because she's like, go in order like the alphabet. I'm like, well, how am I sure?
Right.
There's just, I'll tell you another story. So I took my daughter to, you're gonna laugh, the Kennedy Center, which is this beautiful venue in DC. It's wonderful. We went to see the Nutcracker.
Okay.
I didn't grow up seeing the Nutcracker. I don't even know what the story is about, but it was the ballet. It was like the Tchaikovsky ballet Nutcracker. We come home, and during the whole thing, my daughter's like, what's going on? I'm like, I don't know. They're not talking. They're not saying anything. And I said to my neighbor, I said, yeah, we have no idea what's going on. There's no dialogue. And they look at me, they're like, they're talking in a ballet. I'm like,
right. Like, what did you expect? I don't know, because I don't know what I don't know.
Plays on the South Side.
That's hilarious. Well, I think it brings it back too, right? Like how even in work conversations, we might make a reference to something and you're assuming that person even likes to watch TV or likes to watch the same things you like. And I think that's one way too. I think that technology has really connected us to actually learning, all these narratives and all these things that happen in our world. I'm sorry, but this is actually nothing new under the sun. No. This has all been happening. The difference now is that we have so much rapid information and access to it that we actually do know what's going on with other groups of people outside of our own, other countries outside. And then when you're determining what to do with that information, and you become culpable in a way. So if I see something And I know it's an injustice. It doesn't mean that you're going to be on some bandwagon or you're going to find a solution, but at least I'm aware now, oh, there are other ways of living. There are other ways of being. So one of the questions I want to ask you before we close out and get to your shameless plugging, we always close out with unapologetically living out my purpose, where you're just sharing about what you're working on, what you're excited about, and where we can find you online. But I do have a question then. Thanks for just number one, being so open and vulnerable with our audience, Aimee, because to be able to do that is a lot harder than I think a lot of people think. And I just appreciate you sharing tidbits of your cultural origin story, some very personal things. And I thank you. I thank you for that. So my question then,
opportunity.
yes, you are so welcome. One of my questions is, what is a frequently asked question that you get being in educational research? And I know that's very broad. For those of us who are more nerdy, there's very scientific types of researchers and studies and all those things. But broadly, what's a question you get asked a lot? And maybe it's one that people would be surprised, but what's a frequently asked question you get, because you've now been kind of in this educational research world for what, upwards of a decade or 2 decades? Whoa. What was that from? Wayne's World?
Yeah.
We're not worthy. What's a frequently asked question you've gotten, like a lot, that comes to mind?
So probably the most frequent, so I was a turnaround lead, and for those, like, turnaround is not really talked about anymore, but it's like this crazy comprehensive improvement strategy where we throw everything on the table and discern what's going to work and what's not. Oftentimes folks would rather just wipe the slate clean, close the school, open another school. It's very disruptive.
You can't fire your way to the top. There's
right.
some models that are better than others.
Yeah.
Transparency, another crosshair of our journeys. Justine has also been a turnaround administrator in her past life.
Yes. So, and yes, which is how we bonded, because
we knew the world of it and we knew the intent and the heart of it. Yeah. But then we had also seen kind of the dark underbelly of that as well, because we have people like us who we just want the opportunity to make impact and serve. And you start to realize, especially as you rise into administrative roles and have those other lenses, you realize there's much, much more at play. And it is not student-centered, which is why I'm excited about your book. But back to the frequently asked questions.
So it's usually, can we, something along the lines of, can we expect to see improvements in academics in a year? Or how quickly can we do turnaround? Or can we just do turnaround focusing on instruction? Or, so it's I would say a real lack of understanding of what's happening at these schools.
Yeah.
That is still, and I think we've gotten much better at understanding the need for really a comprehensive examination and work, and leading versus lagging priorities and such. I would say if you're focusing on instruction first, you're probably not understanding what's really going on. So, that's always, it's basically some form of, what's the silver bullet to turn around a school?
Yeah. So you still getting, you're still getting a lot of questions and perspectives of, and I wonder what would be really fascinating. I wonder, and if you watch this from another country and want to comment, I wonder what that kind of has looked like. I mean, we know from studying some models, usually some of the systems that are doing really well around the globe, But I do wonder what that has looked like as far as school improvement in other countries. And I don't know if you touch on that in your book, only from the lens of we are in a very capitalistic country and we're also in a very results. What can I do? What can I do? When will I get it? When will I get it? And because of that mindset, I think, unfortunately, that is a lot of the bias that informs exactly what you named, which is people don't even realize that they're not being realistic. They're not getting on the balcony from the dance floor. They're saying, just help me survive. Just help me get some type of result, instead of really understanding the magnitude of what's required. But I think that's a bigger, like, it's a microcosm of the bigger nature of very capitalistic countries.
Yeah,
Oh, well, you can't turn that ROI around to me? Like, it's that
right.
kind of thing. And it's like, but we're dealing with little humans. We're not dealing with a conveyor belt of you creating shoes or whatever you're going to sell.
Exactly.
But yet that's how our kids have been viewed for years.
Right. And so one of the things I didn't look at improvement efforts and the effects, but I did look at teacher working conditions, the number
Nice.
of hours teachers work, the qualifications of teachers, which honestly are very similar in the US compared to other countries, but our teachers are teaching the most, like the most hours. They're paid one of the lowest. Our country pays its teachers compared to all the other OECD countries, one of the lowest salaries out there. And then the one thing though that really blew me away was OECD looks at equity and schools' ability to basically not take over, but have effect on students that go counter to where they grew up. So can schools kind of counteract a student's background and they look at a multitude of factors: socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, immigration status, etc. We think we are a very democratic, very equal opportunity society. We are one of the least equitable countries in the greater Western civilization. So we have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely.
It was very surprising though, because you think like, oh yeah, we have issues in the US, but I'm sure we're doing much better than most other countries. No.
No, the crazy part is too, like, again, when you get into really unearthing, if you choose to go down this route, listeners, but if you get into really unearthing just the design of our public schools in America, it's like it's destined to be where Aimee just described it, because we are also then painted a picture of something that it's not. So there's almost like a compounding factor. One of my colleagues, well, he's actually one of my finance advisors. His wife is a project manager for some construction companies. And he said her biggest client for years, until she couldn't take it anymore, was one client, and they were on the hook for guess what two types of buildings they designed exclusively. And there was only certain types, and she couldn't take it anymore because she knew the end result, and also because they were the most boring project she's ever had, because meaning there was no wiggle room for innovation whatsoever. What two building types do you think she was managing for that large provider?
If I were to guess, it would be a prison and a school.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
So
there's been research in communities. This is so gross. There's been research in communities that determine the capital planning of their prison system based on their third grade reading score. I mean, it's just, there's lots.
There's a lot you can.
But I also want to celebrate and give credence where credence is due, which is the absolute hard work that's happening in schools by teachers, by administrators. I think where this conversation often lands is the work that the school needs to do. And I think what we've shared, Justine, is that it's much bigger. To
Yep.
expect that the schools are going to unravel 200 years of a system that is designed to get two distinct different outcomes for students, a system that's designed where communities are disinvested. There's, like you talked about the West Side and the South Side, and absolutely, like you drive through our
Under
communities,
resource.
you will roll up your windows, lock your cars, and get the hell out of Dodge. And if you stop, what you'll notice is that there are families who have children that they love and care for and want what's best for them. There are generations
Yep.
of families that live in these communities that want just what you want for their kids. We are so much more similar than not, but I think what you pointed out is that inequity of opportunity. And don't get me wrong, there are opportunities in every single community.
There are.
They just differ.
They differ at the scale, yeah, and also the accessibility, what you named earlier about even just the communication and education of what's possible,
Right.
of knowing that there's different out there. And to Amy's point, celebrating the fact that we both still get to work in education, and we also get this privilege of we get a broader lens because we are no longer school or district based. We've been able to be working from an external partnership lens for a number of years. And the beauty of that is, and I think it probably helps both of us keep going, is yes, we can know those things are true. We can know that we've experienced kind of seeing that dark underbelly and everything that's not working, but it gives all of us more power the more that we continue to share and name those things to say, now let's innovate and let's reimagine how this could be equitable. And we do see a lot of districts and schools, they're doing it. And so you have those pockets of greatness. And I do really think that we're at a tipping point time where people are realizing exactly what we've both named, which is, well, we can do this and we can get incredible results and we love our community, but also we're not going to do this in the same system. And this system has to be overturned and reimagined. So I do think we're kind of approaching that point finally where, and I don't know, it might get worse before, it might continue to be worse before it gets better in different pockets. For example, when we're recording this, all of Los Angeles Unified School District just decided to go on strike. So whenever you see this, just know that, it's still very recent and happening consistently. That, I mean, that's the second largest public district in our country. And so you're putting out over 450,000 families. So like it's those pieces, but then you also look at the necessity of those things, because that is what applies the pressure and says, you can't continually have us doing this in these conditions, and most of all doing it to our students.
Right.
When then the system isn't being revamped, you're still trying to, as the Bible would say, you're trying to put new wine into old wineskins, and it's not going to work. So this has been a lovely conversation. I could, well, we have talked for hours and hours before about education, viewers, but I could literally talk with Aimee all day about school stuff. So I'm excited to see what your future holds, and how your book continues to gain momentum. So I do want to close out with you being a little on the spot and unapologetically living out your purpose. Let us know, what else are you working on right now? What kind of responses are you getting with the book? Where can we find you or follow you? Are there any new projects you're working on you're excited about? Tell us all things Dr. Evan.
Well, thank you. So shameless plug, I can feel my cheeks burning right now.
I'm pushing her out of her comfort zone.
Right. So the book you can find on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you get your books. You can get it in an ebook or paperback. I personally like paperback. I don't like killing trees, but I do like having something.
It's a
tangible.
matte. It's a matte cover.
Yeah.
I just love. If you're not viewing this, I'm petting her book right now.
Arnie Duncan was so sweet. He wrote the foreword, which I was quite honored. I think it was the Chicago connection for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, so right now I'm working on, I am very excited to share. We have a grant and I just pitched, and I don't know if I'll get it, but I'm going to share it anyway because I'm going to put it out there. And you know, maybe if I don't get it through the thing that I pitched, then maybe I'll get it somewhere else. But I just pitched, you're going to crack up. I want to do a pod class where it's like a mashup of a podcast, the convenience of a podcast. You could take it with you. You can listen on a walk, in the, driving, wherever, doing the dishes, which is where I listen to podcasts, and a class, because I really wrote the book not as a call to action, but a mechanism for one. So I really wanted to put in there tools, resources, the why, the what, the how, all of that to ensure this tipping point actually tips.
Yeah.
And when it does, we have some resources and tools to be able to pick up and move forward. But I think, we're all like, I'm once a teacher, always a teacher. I also recognize that just reading a book isn't going to be the thing that really does it.
Yeah.
Folks need to talk together, learn from one another, work together, collaborate around some of these things that we're trying to reimagine, redesign. So the class part is just that, like what now? Where do we go from here? And then what I'm super excited about is I have a grant where we can actually invite peer groups where we will work with them in peer groups to go even deeper. So there's this framework called the knowledge and implementation continuum. And that's kind of what I'm following. It's like the book was the information, it was introducing the ideas. The podcast part could dig in deeper. The class part sort of takes folks even further. And then the peer group, for those who really want to like roll up their sleeves and get into it, is an opportunity to really implement and apply. And what am I talking about? The biggest thing is this different, changing, tweaked idea around school improvement, where we, instead of waiting for schools to need a turnaround effort, we actually identify them earlier and get them the supports they need to get back on track. So that's the big crux. So that's where
when can people so assuming that all moves forward, when can people like start to look for info on that, or can they sign up for a wait list? Like, how does that work?
That is a great question, Justine, and I appreciate the because
it's okay if you're not sure yet. I just have to ask.
Well, so we have a cohort that we're working with now.
Oh, perfect.
We will have another cohort that we'll be signing folks up with starting in October of 2023. If folks are interested, they can find me either, I'm on Twitter at Aimee Evan. I'm on LinkedIn. You can search for me, Aimee Evan. I'm at WestEd. I'm at Aimee.Evan. Aimee.Evan at wested.org. They can reach out to me via email. I'm happy, as always, to talk about these topics, to do workshops like you. I mean, I think that was the other place where we really
coming, you all. We're gonna collab on something,
right?
What yet? But something.
Something.
And I think that's important. You brought that up earlier, but we did get the opportunity to work on multiple projects together in our PhD journeys here, which we realized like, oh, this is fun.
Yeah.
So I was just happy when you're like, yeah, I'll be on your podcast.
Well, I was excited you reached out. I appreciate it.
Well, it has been a pleasure. Again, listeners, subscribers, we will, if you look below, we have all the links for her page at WestEd, all the things that we do for any of our guests so that you can dive in. You could go follow her on Twitter, etc., all the things. But most importantly, we will also below, you can order her book. And we do that again for any of our guests, anything that they're working on. You can always look in the comments under the resources section, and it's going to be anything we talked about. I will probably be extra nerdy for this one and try to pull the Coleman stuff and like link the research of what we reference. So again, a reminder to you all, if you're not taking advantage of that, go to the show notes because we always link resources, even on our shorter format episodes. So, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Evan. And thank you, listeners, subscribers, for showing up for yourselves most of all. And let's continue to get compassionately curious together. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for showing up for yourself, first and foremost, and for sitting down to have a conversation with us in this episode of the Cultural Capacity Podcast. I'm your host, Justine Gonzalez, and I encourage you to first and foremost check out our website, educatoraid.com, as well as any of the linked resources in the resource section of our show notes. And finally, be sure you hit subscribe on your preferred platform. For podcast preference, we stream on Audible, Amazon Prime, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Don't forget to give us a 5-star review when you're over there on those platforms. And then you can also click to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is also in the resource section of our show notes. The reason why you would want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, number one, it is where we stream and premiere all of our featured voices interviews, which also include video, especially if you want to see, hear, interact with, and feel like you are sitting down a part of the conversation. I would always recommend that modality. However, it's also the place where we're going to continuously be releasing free high-level learning workshops for you and your team. So you're going to want to hit subscribe to the Educator Aid Incorporated official YouTube channel, as well as check out all of the resources that we put in the resource section of the show notes. Again, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Cultural Capacity Podcast. Let's continue to get compassionately curious together.